We know that forgiveness is one of the bonds, one of the deepest bonds that holds us. Help us to understand forgiveness and make it part of our lives and the way we live. All this we offer in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Soda. And they probably are the primary practitioners, and primary by I mean the first practitioners, or among the first practitioners of the medical model of drug and alcohol treatment. Food addiction, I should add as well. And one of the things I learned as a chaplain for them, and also a group convener, is that people had an almost impossible task to believe they were forgiven. I'll read you a quote later on if we get time, but one of my favorite professors and friends is a guy named Stanley Harwis. And Harwis points out it is so much easier to forgive other people than feel forgiven. Does that resonate with you? Forgiving other people almost becomes an assault in some cases, doesn't it? Yeah, I'm going to forgive you anyhow. I don't care. So what did I do? But to feel forgiven, that's, I think, one of the most difficult challenges we have. So I'm going to ruin this whole thing, so you don't have to read the book or come the next 2 Sundays, but it really comes down to this. God's already forgiven you. One of the most shocking things that finally hits Christians in the head, And you don't hear this, I'm sorry to say, in most churches. I did hear it in the Episcopal Church. I did not grow up in the Episcopal Church, but I did hear it here. 40 years ago, was Christ has already forgiven you. Christ died on the cross for your forgiveness. Now, that was 2,000 years ago. And I wasn't born then. I'm getting old. I've got a birthday coming up, but I wasn't born 2,000 years ago. And I was already forgiven. Already forgiven. What kind of God is that? If you were to write a formula for forgiveness in our world, what would it look like? You do something wrong, make that an exclamation point. So how do we do forgiveness in our community? Equals? Okay, we've done something wrong. We're punished. And then it goes to, well, you pay for that punishment. I mean, there's a kind of a payment, if you will, right? So punishment, pay. What's that saying? If you do the crime, you got to do the time. Gosh, you got to do that too well. And then you do the payment, and then the whole thing becomes, then you're forgiven. Okay? Last but not least, you're forgiven. I'm sorry, I am not used to writing on these. But here's the weird part. So, we do something that separates us from God. And what's God's first step? What's wrong? There's something wrong with that, doesn't it? In the calculations of our lives, we don't talk about that very much. And I'm going to talk about the Lord's Prayer here in just a couple of minutes when you hand that out to you. But one of the problems with the Lord's Prayer, it's an okay translation, not a great translation, unfortunately. But as I was saying to Judy beforehand, you can't even move some of the Greek words into English because the verb tenses don't exist anymore. I know that seems impossible, it's true. So, one of the strange things that happens in the Lord's Prayer is that we talk about we're going to forgive others as we're forgiven. I cannot begin to tell you how many sermons I've heard preached on that, is that you need to forgive other people so you can be forgiven, as if it was a financial relationship, a fiscal relationship. You will be forgiven as God forgives you, as you forgive other people. In other words, it's a one-to-one capitalistic exchange of money. But what really happens, I'll show you in a few minutes here, I hope, is that God says in that prayer, the prayer that Jesus teaches us, is that when we recognize that other people are already forgiven, That's the aorist tense I was telling you about. It's something that already took place long ago. When we realize that people are already forgiven, then we need to acknowledge that and acknowledge our own forgiveness. And there's a reason for that, because if you want to be a citizen of the kingdom of God, which is what the Lord's Prayer is about, if you want to be a citizen of the kingdom of God, then you need to function as a forgiven person, recognizing your and your and your and your forgiveness. You know, I didn't point at you, I apologize. But it's true, you're forgiven. Okay? That's the strange thing about the Lord's Prayer, is that bond ties us together. I'm trying to figure out how to best talk about the book, and so what I thought I would do is pull two incidences out of the book that are critical to its development. What I do is I talk about the history of forgiveness. No surprise, forgiveness once upon a time, 3,000 years ago, was a simple equation of, you did something, pay me back. You killed my cow, you give me another cow, or your maiden daughter, or whatever the case may be. And we're even. There was no emotional freight to that. If you look in the Old Testament, you discover this time and time again. So the next move I make is from history to the Old and then the New Testament, and to the modern understandings of forgiveness, which are considerably more freighted with responsibility. One of my favorite stories in the book, if you come to this, is about the Amish. You remember the schoolgirl murders? The guy broke in there, and to this day they don't really know why. He was just Looney Tunes, mentally ill. I think he assaulted a couple of the women, but though they don't talk about that, and the Amish wouldn't talk about that. But when he heard the rescuers coming, he sent the men running, or the boys running. They had contacted people, of course, no phones, right? But they sent everybody out running to find help. When the help started arriving, no weapons, of course, but it starts arriving, they began killing the girls. And if I'm not mistaken, he eventually killed himself. Now here's the crazy part. For most people, and this made people furious when it was reported in the newspaper, the crazy part is that the people who first came to help his family, attend to the needs of his family, were who? Family of the victims. More people were at the man's funeral from the Amish community than anybody else. And people say, well, how can the Amish do that? And one of the things that you have to struggle with is, what we're going to be talking about is, how do you live a life of forgiveness? How do you get to be that kind of person? How do you get to be the kind of person where forgiveness is your natural estate? That you forgive others and you accept your own forgiveness. Well, let's turn to the first passage I have here. It's from Matthew chapter 18, which used to be, and sometimes they still call it, I've been so long on a seminary, I don't even know for sure in a few years, but it used to be called the Handbook of the New Testament. And the interesting thing about Matthew chapter 18, when you go home and flip it open, you go through, there's all kinds of things you have to do in order to get along as a church. How should you operate? And one of the things that happens about halfway through chapter 18, 2/3 of the way through the chapter, is that Jesus gives them instructions on how to settle the differences. So if somebody sins against you, what's your first step? Do you remember? Don't be afraid to speak out. I'm not. No grade.
Forgive.
Forgive. So one person goes within the church, goes to speak to the person. So Cake has got a beef with me. Cake sends one other person. Cake comes and talks to me. Now, if I don't change, what's the next step?
Bring the group.
Bring the group. Bring the church. Bring other people. 2 or 3 others. In fact, there's another step. Bring the whole church. And here's the part that people often overlook in here, by the way, which, before we set this up, is what happens then? What's the last step? Let that person be to you as a tax collector. Reject them, right? Except what was Matthew, supposedly? A tax collector. let that person be to you the author of the Gospel of Matthew. It is a way of saying it. The very person's writing that down. This is the wonderful irony of forgiveness in the in the New Testament. We tend to think about forgiveness as, it's done, it's over, it's finished, it's moving on. If you don't take it, it's lost to you. But that's not the case with Matthew, is it? Well, everybody's heard all that kind of stuff, and the disciples are standing by, and then there's Peter there. And you remember Peter? I used to be a high school teacher. I think, Gay, you were a teacher once upon a time. Anybody else a former teacher? There we go. Throw your hand up in the air for the number of kids you've had in your classroom that go, ooh, 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 with the answer the first time, right? Peter is like that kid. Ooh, 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 I know the answer. I know the answer. So he turns to Jesus, and he says here in this verse, Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? And he volunteers, as many as 7 times? Now, I don't know how slow or fast to go through this, but 7 is like 40 in the ancient world. It's kind of an indeterminate number. It's a perfect number, but indeterminate. Even today, if you're traveling on the West Bank, and I've spent a lot of time among Palestinians, lots of time among Palestinians, if somebody says to you, the bus will be here in 20 minutes, 25, maybe 25. If somebody says the bus will be here in an hour, maybe an hour. If somebody said it'll be here in 40 minutes, just relax. Because 40 is an indeterminate number in that culture. 7 is like that too. So Peter here is acting magnanimous, right? You see, how many times should I forgive somebody? 7 times? And you can hear people saying that to themselves and to others, right? 7 times? Now that does feel magnanimous. And what does Jesus say to him in return? Not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, I talk a tiny bit about this in the book, but one of the things I have to say, anybody in here ever have been in a relationship? Married even? 77 times. Think about that. I just introduced, some of you were here, my wife was here for a moment, she's singing this morning. What if I said to her, oh, Kathy, that's 36. Right? You got 41 more, and we don't have that many years left. Okay? You would know that if someone answered like that, that was pretty perverse. If they were keeping track, any relationship, any marriage, if someone's keeping score, you know what a problem you have, right? Well, what's happening here is that Jesus says 77 times. So there's one other issue here that's behind all of this is rule following. And this is a big problem for Christians in the 21st century and the latter part of the 20th century. There are rules, and we ought to live by them. Now, we can make exceptions to those rules if we have an interest at stake. Lots of evangelical churches have taken that stance. But we have rules, and by God, you ought not to break those rules. Adultery is a rule. Homosexuality is a rule. Stealing is a rule. Fraud is a rule, right? Right?
Yeah.
Except. And when we run into one of the problems with rule following, I used to be the canon theologian of the Diocese of Arizona. I was responsible for teaching philosophy and theology to future clergy. And one of the ways I could show them that was I roll up the ball paper, I'd say, let's play a game, and I would throw it to somebody like Lee. Lee would grab the ball of paper, and then I'd say, what do we do next? Throw it back? Throw it to somebody else? Bat it? Kick it?
Put it in the trash?
Trash it?
Put it in your pocket.
Put it in your pocket? You see the problem here? We don't know what to do without some kind of context for these rules. If there's not rules, if there's not a game, as it were, or rules to the game, then there's no context. And no context, we don't know what to do next. And so one of the problems we have in trying to follow rules, rule following it's called in philosophy, is how quickly you can get derailed when you don't fully grasp the context. And that is one of the problems for the modern times is what's the context for us? We've watched that in the political climate. I'm not commenting on either party one way or another, but I will say to you, when people say facts are not facts,
Truth is that.
and both parties have taken that position on things, then you have a problem, right? What are the rules you should follow in those circumstances? And there's enormous confusion that comes from that. Well, we have the same kind of problem with forgiveness. So, how do we resolve that? Well, one of the ways we do that is we tell a story. We tell a story. This is one of my favorite stories in the Bible because it has hope for me. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. Sounds like a big deal, doesn't it? Do you know how much a talent is worth in modern dollars? Do you have any feel for this? Because this really changes the whole nature of the story, if you know what a talent's worth. 1.25 million. $1.25 million. That's a talent. So 10,000 talents is
15?
$125 billion. Okay? That would have been bigger than the gross national product of almost every country in the ancient world at that time, except perhaps Rome and Egypt. $125 billion. Now, for all those people who question the historical Jesus, I understand that. Okay? But I want to say to you here, is this about history or is this making a point instead? Is he making a point? Okay? Did anybody ever really do this? Probably not, because what king could have amassed that much money? Okay? So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And what does the king do? And out of pity, that word pity there is the same word as for compassion in Greek. And it's an interesting word because it evokes the bowels and the stomach. Compassion or pity comes from here. Okay? Out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him, and what? Now, I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of time in my adult years hoping the Episcopal Church would come around and support the absolution of third world debt. You know, that kind of comes and goes off of our screen, and unfortunately goes off our screen, but many of the countries around the world owe money to us or to China. They owe so much money to us that 10,000 talents would seem like nothing. And yet, they can't pay it back. They have no gross national product to pay it back. So the interesting thing here is to forgive a debt is to somehow eliminate something, to set it free. You're not just changing the equation. You're setting people free. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. Now, a denarii is an interesting number. It's $3.65 in today's market, or roughly. So he owes them $365 as opposed to $125 billion. And what does he do? You know how the story goes?
Yeah.
He refuses to absolve him, refuses to forgive the debt. Okay? And in refusing to forgive the debt, he demands that the guy be thrown into prison because he will have no patience with him. Now, when the fellow slaves saw what happened, as he says here, when the fellow slaves saw what happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their Lord all that had taken place. And the Lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should not you have mercy That's that word pity and mercy are both the word compassion from your gut on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you. And in anger the Lord handed him over to be tortured until he could pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother and sister from your heart. I won't tell you everything in here because otherwise you won't buy the book. But it's really interesting in here. What's going on is they hand somebody over to debtor's prison. Now I have an attorney in here, I know, Terry. Do we still have debtor's prison in our time?
Not really, but yes, we do.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. And what's the problem with debtor's prison?
You can't earn the money to pay back the debt.
You can't pay it back.
Or get a job again.
You know, if there was people have argued that one of the foundations of the American colonial system wasn't capitalism. It was the realization if you threw somebody in prison, you could never get the debt back. And so we figured out how to get people to pay us back what they owed us over time. Okay? But this guy the king is saying, throw him into prison. And not only throw him into prison, but the word actually in Greek is torment him. Torment him. Well, prison was his own torment in those days. When they threw people into prison in the New Testament times, nobody ever expected to come out. One could argue that some of our prisons are like that today, but they didn't expect you to come out because if you needed food, who brought you food? It wasn't the prison. Okay? If you didn't have friends or family that brought you food, you wouldn't get food. And what were the circumstances of a prison?
Dismal.
Well, typically it was a lot like my grandmother's pickling cellar, under her house. They used to scare the crap out of me. She used to say, "Go down there and give me some green beans, honey." And I'd go down there and worms would be crawling out of the dirt walls, and the snake would run out through the door. You're underground in the dark. And what happens to people that are underground in the dark and a damp environment? They get sick and they die. Nobody sent you to prison because they expect you to come out. But to send them to debtor's prison on top of that was a double stroke. Now, did Jesus intend that? Well, I suspect that's just as hyperbolic as $125 billion. But it's a caution to people who don't forgive with pity, mercy, compassion from the gut. So they didn't talk about heart in those days as the seat of virtues. They talked about your gut as the seat of virtues. And if you get upset about something, you're feeling guilty or sad or whatever, where does it hit you? Does your heart bother you? You find yourself running off to take a medicine for your heart? No. You go take a Pepsi, right? Or a Tums. That's where we're upset. It comes from there. This is where the everyday part of life is focused in the ancient world. And so what he's functionally saying, you can pull this apart, keep going with this, he's functionally saying your everyday practice ought to be forgiveness. Knowing what? That you've already been forgiven. Do you hear that in there? You've already been forgiven. And a lot. Now, I just want you to know, I always tell my wife that I was a goody two-shoes when I was in high school. That's how I ended up being a clergyman. You don't believe it, do you? I can see that right away. I was not a good two-shoes at all. I was always in trouble. I went to a little Methodist college in Iowa because the minister of the church came over and told my parents, this is the biggest Methodist church in Minnesota, took the time to come and say to my parents, you got to send him to this school in Iowa because he is such a wild man. It'll calm him down. I sent my boys there. It would be good for him too. Of course, when I got down there, I discovered his sons were wonderful men. Really attractive, athletic, capable guys. And that there wasn't a woman safe within 400 miles of these guys. He didn't know that. What's that?
What exactly do you mean by there wasn't a woman safe in the Me Too
I'm not sure.
era?
That's not a great phrase.
I think that, I would say something along the line of what Judge Kavanaugh's been accused of. They were the kind I don't know if people were responsive and how you would hold them capable for being responsive. But the point of the matter was, they were wild men. So they sent me off down to the school there. Now, this is what I want to say to you. Building on building on building, and I'm by no means, and quite the opposite, have been sin-free as a clergy person. I thought being a clergy person would preserve me from sin. A few people have been preserved, like Gay Lawson, but most of them...
I'll work for
Maybe Jed, I don't know.
Maybe.
But I've been a sinner. I mean, I truly have. And what is sin? Well, it's not an action, as it turns out, when you're reading the book here. It's not one thing. It's not one thing. It's a disposition. It's a habit. It's a habit of practice. It's a practice like forgiveness. And so you talk to the greatest theologians in the world today and ask them what the definition of sin is, and it'll be as simple as this: doing things that are self-destructive and destructive of others. And nothing more complicated than that. Or doing something that God doesn't wish for you. I think the greatest theologian of our time, who's practically an impenetrable reader to read, he just died not too long ago. I can't quote the line exactly, but it's something to the effect, and I think I have it in the book: doing that which God does not wish for you. It's an interesting function of sin, isn't it? We tend to think about sin as stealing cars or doing this or doing that, but it's a disposition. It's how we see the world. I remember Jimmy Carter being mocked and made fun of. And at the time I felt uncomfortable with people mocking and making fun. I didn't know why. As life went along, I began to understand why. Do you remember his Playboy interview?
Yeah.
It's okay. I know you just read the stories. The Playboy interview. You remember that? Do you remember the issue was? What did he say? He lusted in his heart. He sinned against his wife, I might add, but he lusted in his heart. And people made fun of him for that. But who was he echoing in there? Jesus. If you've done it in your heart, you've done it in fact. Right? That's what Jesus said. And, you know, I've talked to people about that. I have over the years, and people come in for counseling or just theological discussion or whatever the case may be. If you've done it in your mind, heart, whatever the case may be, in the mind of Jesus, it's like having done it. Now, if done it was a one-off act, discrete act, you'd say, no, that's not true. Jimmy Carter, we know Jimmy Carter, that big toothy smile. There was nobody's going to come on to Jimmy Carter just because he was attractive, right? He didn't do something. It was his attitude. It was his way of living. It was his habits, his virtues, his practices. And he became aware through that experience that he needed to focus on building relationship with his wife so he would be strong for her and for his love for her and for his attraction for her. And marvelously, apparently, they've managed to keep that together all these years, right? What are they, 96 and 92? Did I read that the other day? And they say they're still happily married with a straight face. Follow what I'm saying here? Let me make a further point. Well, let me stop there for just a second before we get to the Lord's Prayer. Any observations or questions? And Barb, to your point about Me Too movement, I don't know what to say about it. Having been at the other end of it as a male, I can't hear an accusation without just cringing at one time or another. Because I certainly have not attacked women like that he's been accused of, but I must have thought of it. And I cringed. I don't know what to say to you other than that.
Yeah, my point was describing those men as not a woman was safe. I just wanted to clarify what it was you actually meant by that.
Well, there's a long essay about by a really good theologian talking about Potiphar's wife. Do you remember the story of Potiphar? Potiphar's wife. Joseph is taken in, nice Jewish guy, nice looking guy, young guy, is taken into the house of Potiphar, who's the treasurer, I think, of Egypt. And his wife is attracted to him. And what does she do? She keeps trying to seduce him all the time. And people put the weight of, they've explained a lot of modern behavior by that. But if you actually read the story, the context is really quite different. The circumstances are different. So if you were trying to make the example of Potiphar's wife as a rule for our time, you'd be stuck pretty quickly. It wouldn't work. That's the problem when rule follows. So let's go to the Lord's Prayer. Matthew 6. When you are praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do. Meaning, more prayers doesn't by itself. For they think that they will have been heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. We race by that line all the time, but what does it mean? Any ideas? See?
We don't have any secrets.
We don't have secrets from God, right? Yeah. And what does it mean to need something? What do we need from God? Yeah, is there anything we don't need from God? I don't know about you. I get up in the morning, I take a big inhalation of air every morning, almost every morning anyhow. I have coffee, which I need. All these things that I need, I get from whom? I get them from God, right? I get them from God. So if God already knows what I need before I begin my prayer, what does that say about the nature of prayer?
Well, I think prayer is for us, not for God. I mean, it changes me. It's not going to change God. And it's for me to recognize God's presence with me.
I buy that. Other definitions of prayer.
Could you repeat what Peggy said?
It's about her, or about us, I should say, and that it's for changing us, not changing God.
Thank you.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anything else about prayer?
More about listening than it is about talking.
More about listening than talking.
Communicate.
If God already knows what you need.
I don't need to tell him.
Yeah.
It's an outward expression that we want to be as He wants us, and we're appealing to Him that we don't know, we're ignorant, but help me to be what You want me to be. It's like giving in your will.
Yeah. Surrendering
Yeah.
to God so you can build this relationship with God.
I just like chatting.
Chatting with God. Yeah.
Listen.
What Jesus is actually saying here is all of these things you've said. I mean, you got it. But He's actually going one step further, because prayer begins with God, not with us. God is the one that teaches us to pray. If we left our own prayers of our own accord, we tend to pile up things that we need and want. But you'll notice he says, what you need. Thanks. Okay. What you need. So prayer begins with God. Now, when we come to the Lord's Prayer here, how does it begin? Well, we've said it all so many times. I remember you had to memorize all those for confirmation? You didn't. Okay. First Communion. Okay. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. So that's a formal address. That comes from Jewish prayer. God, I know who you are. I recognize you. Holy are you. Holy meaning set aside. I remember Jed preaching a sermon, and much of it was about holiness, is that we're set aside. Okay. You're holy. You're different. You're there. We're here. You're hallowed. So what's the very first petition that encompasses the whole prayer? You see what it is? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. What's our primary prayer? That a kingdom comes. That we become citizens of the kingdom. And how do we become citizens of the kingdom? Well, it's fairly simple. You see, what do we need for our daily bread? Just food and water every day, or food and drink every day. If you walk through here, what you'll discover, these are all the steps for being citizens of the kingdom of God. through the Lord's Prayer. I included on there a paraphrase of the Bible, which I believe Jed likes as much as I do. It's the Eugene Peterson. We've laughed about it because there's probably, I think, was it now up to 39 translations of the Bible that are approved for use in church on Sunday morning, but not Eugene Peterson. And if you don't own a copy of the Message, I recommend it to you because you can actually sit down and just read through it. Our Father in heaven, reveal who you are. Set the world right. Do what's best. As above, so below. So in other words, make this world reflect your life as the kingdom of God. That's what we ask him. Keep us alive with 3 square meals. That's all we ask. Not hard, is it? Now we come back to the one about forgiveness, but he said, keep us safe from ourselves and the devil. In fact, in the Greek, it says, save us from the time of trial. Trial meaning those where we ourselves are tried by our own dispositions. Save us from that. But it can also mean, certainly, anticipating what Jesus is going to experience for Christians, that we're going to be on trial for our faith and for convictions. Lots of people are going to be on trial. Lots of people. There's you recognize the name Martin Niemöller? Do you recognize that? A biography just came out about him. I haven't bought it, but I hope to at some point. Martin Niemöller, and very little has been written about him, but he's the one that said, first they came for the Poles, and I was silent. Then they came for the handicapped and the poor, and I was silent. And then they came for the Jews, and I was silent. And then what? And then they came for me. Okay? Martin Niemöller is best. That's a time of trial for you. I have a book, and I've shared parts of it with, we have a group of clergy get together here at the church that Jed is called the A-Team. I'd like to think A- maybe. A might be overreaching. But anyhow, A-Team, he calls it A-Team. And I read sections of this in there. I have a collection of sermons that were written by clergy and given by clergy under Hitler. And almost every one of the people who gave these sermons was put to death. Now why is that so powerful? Why should anybody feel threatened by a Christian? Why should anybody feel threatened by the Bible, for that matter? Why should somebody like Hitler be put off by that? A dominating dictator type be put off by that? Well, I'm going to go back to this part about forgiveness. The Greek form of this, I talked about it, but so let me come back to it. It may make a little bit more sense now. Forgive others. There's a form of the verb which we do not have in our time. The only thing past perfect participles that comes close to that. And that's the kind I used to teach grammar, so you can see how I could drive kids crazy with that. I'm going to tell you a little secret. You don't need to know grammar to be a writer. You need to write to be a writer, and then you learn grammar because you need it. Okay, if you want to build a house, you don't say, this is a power saw, this is a hammer, these are the 3 kinds of nails, these are great glazing nails, this is... You tell everybody all that stuff, and they say, go build a house, and what's going to happen? You have no clue. But if you have somebody building a house, and you say, this is what you need, this is a hammer. Now that board's too long. What do you need? A saw. And you want to put those boards together, what do you need? Now there are more than one kind of nail. There are roofing nails, there are framing nails. You know, it goes on and on like that. That's how you build up. So grammar matters, but not in the way we think it does. Not until we use it in a situation like this. This is called an aorist verb. Now, verbs in the ancient world were kind of linear or punctilinear. Linear means it started, it began, and it continues. That'd be one form of saying. So saying or singing. If it was linear, we've always been singing, we're singing now, we'll be singing in the future. Punctilinear was that it's happening. It happened. But there's another form here called the aorist form of the verb. And the aorist form is kind of this strange term, is that it happened and it's done. It's finished business. And that is the word he uses for forgiveness of others. The problem with this is I searched through translations one after another. I finally had to do my own. And I'm not a Greek scholar. I used to have Greek and Hebrew and Latin, no longer. Now I can do it with tools, but I can't do more than what I did. So I sat down and I did a translation, and I was shocked by what I read. It does not come across like that. In fact, I was reading a commentary, probably one of the best commentaries on the Gospel of Luke, for example. And the interesting thing was, Matthew rather, by a Jesuit scholar, who I highly respect. I own several of his books, and I really regard him well. But when it comes to this translation, and he is a Greek scholar, he went what I call the exchange route, or the capitalist route. You get as you give. You give as you get. Now, there are lots of modern people, and most of them are women, I'm grateful to say. Catherine Tanner, Martha Nussbaum are the first ones that come to mind that point out to us that we've been so captured by that model of the exchange model that we can't even imagine that there's a different world. We can't imagine that you got to give something to get something. Now, God did not whisper into the ear of humanity, capitalism is the way. Because we know, and I'm not saying we can put capitalism behind us, I'm not being treasonous to our culture. I'm simply saying because you can compare it to other ways of living, you'll find another experience. And we live in the great Northwest here, and we have one examples of that kind of economy that would just totally throw a wrench into our way of life. And do you know what it is? Any of you know? It's a Native American example. That's it, the potlatch. Where you literally, as a citizen of the village, and usually among the wealthiest citizens of the village, give everything you have away. Everything. Throwing yourself on the trust, throwing yourself entirely on the village. You give everything you have away to the village because you love and care for them, and that's part of your religious devotion. This is serious business. And I can tell you, I had a church that was really in qualms, really in trials. I'd just gotten there, and it was making me crazy. And I actually had a friend that came and offered to anoint the doors to drive out the evil spirits. I didn't accept. But we were talking about finance and stewardship. And it was not going well in that parish. And it should be. It was in a very affluent part of the world. And they were questioning me about how I lived my life. I said, well, I'll tell you what, at the next vestry meeting, I will bring you a copy of what? My tax returns. I'll bring a copy of my tax returns and I'll share them with you. And how did they respond to that? They flipped out. That was way more information than they wanted to know, okay? That was way more intimate than they ever cared to know about me. And furthermore, it was a witness of a kind, isn't it? So here, back to the Lord's Prayer, because I just got a couple minutes here, I think. Back to the Lord's Prayer. These people have already been forgiven. It's a done deal. Interestingly enough, the next form of the verb of forgiveness, which pertains to us, is also aorist. It's a done deal. And here's the challenge, and I talk about this in the book, and you can find out more about that for $10. Or come next week, as the case may be. But joking aside, one of the things you'll discover is, how do you live as a forgiven person? How does that change your life? If you knew you're forgiven already, how do you live your life? Free. Yeah, that would be one thing. Absolutely. I mean, the truth of the matter is, and here's from Stanley Harwood. Here's 3 quick quotes. You ready? Number 1, that makes us wonder if we really do want to pray that our debts be forgiven as we have forgiven our debtors. In truth, we find it easier to forgive than to be forgiven. We do so because so much of life is spent trying to avoid acknowledging that we owe anyone anything. Yet to be a follower of Jesus, to learn to pray this prayer means that we must first learn that we are forgiven. And he goes on in another section. He says, the forgiveness of debts signals that there's nothing quite so political as a prayer that Jesus teaches us. To have debts forgiven certainly challenges our normal economic and political assumptions. But the forgiveness of debts is also at the heart of a truthful memory. And then finally, just another quick quote. The willingness to be forgiven. There's nothing like harboring a resentment, is there? All day long. Right? But flip that over. The willingness to be forgiven, which may require that I have my enemy tell me who I am, is the only way that reconciliation can begin. Somebody once said in one of my seminary classes, there are only 2 reasons to be married as a Christian. One is because God desires that for you, and the other is to have somebody who can tell you the absolute truth about yourself. I think if you want to know about forgiveness, we can talk more about this next week. If you want to know more about forgiveness, work on it at home. What I want to suggest to you is that word practicing on the cover there is very important. Because practicing forgiveness, learning forgiveness, is like learning to play chess, for example, or learning to ski or bicycle, or any other sort of practice that you can get better at by practicing, by doing it. Same as with forgiveness. If you think forgiveness is a one-off kind of thing and you just have to do it this time and move on, that's not what Jesus is saying to Peter. And the epigraph at the beginning of the book is Peter's question. How many times should I be generous and magnanimous and forgive 7 times? And what does Jesus say? 77 times. David, how many times has Paula forgiven you?
77 times.
Hey, we don't count, right? We don't count. All right. I think I got a couple seconds for questions here. Do I or not? No?
Liberties, you're in charge.
No, I don't feel in charge. You're the boss. Always. Yes.
Saying prayer, the Lord's Prayer, if you're saying prayers at night and morning, go to church, you probably couldn't be saying 3 or 4 times a day. After I get to I Father, I sometimes don't even know what I've said until I get to forgive my debts. How can we translate? Or does God know that we are saying this, even if we're not meaning or listening to every word we're saying?
Well, I think there's a couple things that come into play to that. And this is too quick an answer, I apologize, but mindful of the time. Number one, I think, and we've talked about the nature of prayer here a little while ago, we say things so we know what we're thinking. Okay? And one of the things that's important about the prayer book, and I have this discussion with people who are not Episcopalians all the time, is one of the beauties of the prayer book, as an example, as a book of prayers, is that it teaches us, particularly in those Sunday prayers, is what's important besides ourselves. I've gone to lots of churches. I was raised in the evangelical Methodist tradition. And when people began to pray, what did they pray for? Healing, health, wealth, whatever the case may be. But their instinct typically wasn't, particularly in a time of crisis, was not to pray for others first. And what does the prayer book do for us? The vast majority of our prayers are for other people. It's training. We say these prayers so we can train our heart. We can learn better practices. I think that's why we pray. And it doesn't hurt to say, Our Father. If you stopped right there, you'd be good to go. And now I should add to that, and Horowitz talks about this all the time because he's married to a radical feminist, so he needs to wake up and pay attention to the roses on this one. He said, don't for a moment think that's about earthly father. Because that was always a kind of a sticking point for me. My father and I weren't reconciled to the last decade of his life. And thank God we were. And it was one of the most moving things of my life. But we weren't reconciled. For me to say our Father was always tinted by that relationship. And it was only until later on we realized that Father, in this sense of familiar, this intimate, is what Jesus is directing him to. If we could just say more like this intimate parent, we'd be good to go. Because this is not a God who's distant from us, this is a God who's present to us. And that's the point of that, our Father. So you can't go wrong saying, God, I sure miss you. That would work, right? Other points, questions? Yes, sir.
Along those same lines, as far as changing father to intimate parent, I have need to understand more. You can do anything you want in the Peterson translation. As if God's got a magic wand. I need another translation because I don't like the magic wand.
Yeah. I think part of that's part of what he's talking about in earth and in heaven. One of the things that we tend to forget is we think of, and then I just have this big context, then I'll drill down. We tend to think about heaven as God's residence place, which looks a lot like Northwest Crossing. But the point of the matter is we tend to think about heaven as God's residence. And we forget over and over again that God made the earth and God made heaven. Okay? So inviting God to do what God desires for us is inviting God to love us and care for us any way that God wishes to do that. And I can tell you on a daily basis, I'm shocked and surprised that God thinks well enough of me to love me like that. I really do. And I've gone through some horrible things. I lost a father, I lost a mother, and a year later lost a wife. And people said to me, what happened to your faith in all that? And I said, it grew. It grew. I found somebody, sometimes by other people, sometimes just by direct connection, I found a God who loves me and cares for me. And I might not have known otherwise. I would prefer that they hadn't died, and especially in the fashion they did. But I do know something I didn't know before that. And I hope that when I die, that'll be passed along to people that I love and care for, and even my enemies, I might add. My enemies ought to know that. One last word, and then you got to go to church if you haven't been yet. I honestly believe that if we can learn to practice forgiveness, really sit down and practice forgiveness, that would be the best form of evangelism that Episcopalians could offer. All the buttonholing and door knocking and hanging this and doing that, all those things are good. But if you were in the practice of forgiving other people, where you work and who you live with and all that, and they ask you why do you do things you do, like they did the Amish, and you say, because Christ lives in me, because I forgive and that's who I am, that's my heartbeat, the rhythm of my life, what are people going to think about you as a Christian? They're going to be drawn to you and a community that reinforces that behavior. And I talk a little bit about that again, about the Amish. And there's another story, and I can't remember the name of the movie. It's about the monks in Algeria, French monks in Algeria, who stayed even when they were threatened by Muslim radicals and were put to death. And there's a letter in there, and I quote parts of it in there. And the opening of it, well, if you get a chance, read the book. And if you don't, I'll tell you about it next week. Okay? Thank you for your kind attention. I'm grateful. All right. Talk later. Morning. Good morning. I'm going to get started in just a moment. My wife and Ken are heckling me from the back row back there. I think I introduced my wife to most of you last week. She's back there next to Ken.
No, I'm up here.
Well, it's good to see a few of you coming back from last week. my plan for this morning kind of goes like this, because I was formerly an English teacher in a high school, so junior high and high school, actually. So you would assign a book, and early on I was like, they'll read the book and they'll come back. Welcome to the 70s, that was back in those days. You know, eventually I could get people off the ground on books, but it was always a challenge. Particularly books about theology books may not be the top of everybody's pile, but give it a chance. Give it a chance. Come in, please. There are books, a few books left over there. I think I'm supposed to get new glasses. I know I have 3 prescriptions. I have glasses for looking far away, I have glasses for looking down at the sermon or the computer, and I have glasses for reading that I'm supposed to pick up. You can, but the doctor's uncertain of which one is supposed to work the best, so he said, oh, just spend $100 and you can figure out what it's like for a year. And I'm thinking, okay. Hopefully he'll knock that off his bill next time too, right? And he's a very nice doctor. We like him very much. In any case, I think there are maybe 7 or 8 left over there. They're $10 a piece. They just went on sale on Amazon for the first time today. And they're $19 a piece on Amazon. So, and you can get a Kindle for $9.95, but it finally came out on Amazon, which in today's world means it's real, right? I'm sorry to say that in some respects. But I have to say, in the world of theologians and philosophy, which is what I'm trained in, most of the books that I'm interested in are not available at your local bookstore. And at least since the time I was in seminary, if you wanted those books, you had to order them or get them through a specialized bookstore. Amazon has turned out to be a real gift. I was a Lilly Fellow some years ago, and we used to have to prepare an article for each quarterly meeting. And I did one on an English theologian, and I couldn't get any of the books without using Amazon UK. Did you know you could do that? Amazon UK, Amazon Deutschland, DE, and you go on and on like that. So you can get books like that. In any case, you can get that book here for $10, substantially cheaper than other people. Somebody said, do you think it's fit for a present to other people? And I said, yes. Yes, I think forgiveness is a great gift to give to other people. So I will probably, I have to buy them outright myself. So I probably will buy a few more, and if Jan is up to it, I'll bring them into the office. But those are available today. And if you do want to give them as gifts, be careful about how you give it. Give some thought to that. I get a daily email from a group called Plow, and you can get this email too daily. They are a Mennonite peace group, but they have a lot of other things going on their sites as well, and they have a wonderful journal. I read it online rather than get more paper coming through the mailbox. This just came yesterday, and it said it's found on wrapping paper in the Ravensbrück concentration camp. One of the worst concentration camps. If there were any worse than others, this is one of them. This is found on the paper, rolled up in a corner. Lord, remember not only the men and women of good will, but also those of ill will. But do not remember all the suffering they have inflicted upon us. Remember rather the fruits we brought, thanks to the suffering. Our comradeship, our loyalty, our humility, our courage, our generosity, the greatness of heart that has grown out of this. And when they come to judgment, let all their fruits we have borne be their forgiveness. Wow. Can you imagine? No. All right? I think about that, and I read that, and I was remembering I can't remember the man's name at the moment, but he wrote a book on hope. He's a German philosopher and psychologist. And one of the striking things about the people that survived the camp, the children that survived the camp, there wasn't a ton of them, but there were kids that did survive the camp. And one of the things he discovered in talking to them and examining them was there was a striking number of them became diplomats, physicians, university professors. In other words, they excelled in their relative fields, and they sought achievement in a way that other people didn't. But the thing that came across to them most was that they were at peace and joyful in their lives. At peace and joyful in their lives. There's something about a world in which we live where we can despair over things that are small. As my kids like to say to me, Dad, that's such a first world problem.
Yeah.
You know? And I get very upset about some of those first world problems. But it's nothing compared to some of my friends' experience. Kathy and I support a woman who's a friend of mine, and she works in the slums in Nigeria. And it's horrible.
Slums where?
Slums in Nigeria. And she's a unordained, a missionary, that is, a lay missionary of the Anglican Church over there. Very born again, wonderful woman. Her name is Judith Salenga. And shortly after we married, she appealed to me for some money, and I asked Katie if I could send some money to her. So we sent her $500. And I can't remember all that transpired out of that, but she bought uniforms for everybody. She paid the teachers' wages for a month, and they had a feast in our honor for everybody that was in the school for $500. You follow what I'm saying? Talk about first and third world problems. There you have it. So what I thought I would do today, because I've been an ancient English teacher long ago, is I brought some stuff prepared that we could talk about, or if anybody's had an opportunity to read the book and has some ideas they'd like to bring up, or just questions about forgiveness in general, this would be a great opportunity to do that.
Okay.
Okay?
No, I don't have
I'm
a
ready?
question. I was just agreeing.
Okay. Well, Jed mentioned, and I think this is timely, because one of the things I have on these sheets is there are no abstracts about forgiveness. You can talk in the abstract about forgiveness, but it immediately falls apart when you have to apply it. You follow what I'm saying? Yeah. You can say, well, love your neighbor, love your friends, love yourself, whatever the case may be. But then when you have to apply it to yourself, what happens? I'm sorry, I have a throat lozenge, and it'll disappear pretty soon. One of my favorite jokes of all time. I had a church in Kansas years ago. The head usher came to me and he said, well, when Father Houghton was here, he said every Sunday morning he'd get up and he would take off his watch, he'd place it on the pulpit, straighten his sermon, reach in his pocket, throw something in his mouth, and off he'd go. And 14 minutes later, he was done. 14 minutes later, he was done. Sunday after Sunday, year after year, decade after decade. 14 minutes later, he was done. And then one Sunday morning, he was up there. He reaches into his pocket, puts the watch down, straightens the sermon, and throws it into his mouth. And the sermon lasted for 36 minutes.
Oh.
I said, Father Hutton, what happened? He said, well, you know how I always straighten my sermon? I said, yes. And now I always put my watch out so I could track her time? Yes. He said, what I do is I throw in my mouth a mint. And they're always gone in 14 minutes. I said, well, what happened this time? He said, I threw a button in my mouth. Too horrible to believe, isn't it? Okay, so the point of the matter is you got to deal with real world stuff. And we had some real world stuff all over the national news. Real world stuff took place in New Guinea. I think it was, Indonesia rather. 20-foot waves sweeping through villages there and cities. I think the last count of those dead I read was something like almost 900 people. And that means, of course, that many, many, many more are going to die of dysentery, the number one killer in the world. Okay? Many more are in third world, are going to die from that. So how do we talk about that? Perhaps more timely for us is we watched a potential Supreme Court justice who'd been groomed all his life for that position. The finest private schools. It's a network. I used to teach in a private school many years ago, an Episcopal private school, and I was explaining to my wife that part of the reason you go there, you can get a good education. My daughter went to an Episcopal private school, and you can get a great education. However, the other reason is network. It's connections that you make. I've had a number of my friends go to Harvard, and when Megan turned down Harvard going there, I was a little disappointed for this reason, but I understood. When you go to Harvard, you're never out of work. Your classmates, am I right? Your classmates will find you a job. That's how it works. It's a very connected fruit. So we had a guy who, prepared all his life to be on that chair on that day, and then he hit the fan, right? And there's this lovely human being, I mean lovely in spirit, lovely human being, lovely in spirit, generous and kind, who did not prepare to be there all her life, and yet had to deal with the consequences of it all of her life. She's sitting in that chair. And so Jed and I were talking briefly beforehand about forgiveness in those circumstances. And you got to walk your way through that. You got to deal with it in real worlds. Now, in the book, I talk about a number of situations, perhaps even more dire than that, where people have died. The nickel, and I'll mention it here in a moment, the nickel mine murders. That was the Amish young women.
Yeah.
Remember, the boys were sent fleeing, and the girls were kept behind. And I think, I don't have the details, but the man assaulted a couple of the women. One of the young women, I should say, said, "Take me first." And he did. He did just that. Now, if you think about that, a 12 or 13-year-old who has the presence to do that, where does that come from? What spirit possesses them? I'm told that in almost every Amish classroom, there's one big sign for sure in every classroom, maybe a couple more, but there's one. And it says up there, J, this is, by the way, our new whiteboard. Jed and I wanted to do the blessing of the whiteboard, but we thought we'd save it for later. It says on every one of them, joy, on the wall. Now, that in itself is a wonderful thing to put up. Because, do you know the Amish world? Do you have some sense of what happens in that world? It's truly remarkable. I've lived next to Mound Ridge, Kansas, and there was like the second epicenter of Amish. And they're a hoot to be around in some respects. I mean, until they're 18 years old, they're wild as March hare, okay? More than once, I've seen a wagon finding its way home in the early morning with some drunken Amish boy lying in the back of that wagon. But when 18 comes, what happens? Another interesting thing about him is I saw an Amish man in the hospital every once in a while in a small community in which I lived, Hutchinson, Kansas. You would have hospital chaplaincy duty, and I went to see this Amish man. And he had open heart surgery in there. One of the intriguing things I found out later on is they don't have any insurance. Don't have any insurance. What they do is they take care of one another. So when the bill comes, they bring it home to the church and they split it among themselves. And as I was talking to one of the bishop at the time, he said their insurance costs are about a tenth of ours. They just split it up front. That's just the understanding. So if you bring home a bill, it's spread out to the whole church. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, there's a surgeon right here who's done open heart surgery, right? Not going to remember either. Okay, you see that? So that's the fascinating thing about them is that everything is shared about them. But it's a whole life of formation. And so this J-O-Y, interestingly enough, is joy, but it's also, who's this? Starts with J? Jesus. Jesus first. What do you think the O is? Others. Somebody read the book after all. Okay. That's cheating. I'm up here talking, thinking you haven't read it. And then you, yourself. Now, I would say in the world in which we lived today, that was pretty amazing, isn't it? To think that. And that's still being taught. That's not yesteryear. That's not 50 or 100 years ago. That's today. There's a number of excellent books about that murder, but the best one was written by a number of Mennonites. And Mennonites are like amateur Amish, if you will. I always joke about it because I have a friend who was a Mennonite pastor, the largest Mennonite church in America at one point. And he says it's like being a Methodist, except you don't go to war. Is that right? Chuck would know. Okay. So in any case, these Mennonite fellows who are seminary professors and so on wrote this wonderful book about the murders and the aftermath. But the thing that really struck me, and I think I mentioned in the book, some people were really intrigued by this, that they would be the very first persons at the criminal's grave. They would come to the family and care for the family of the murderer. Some people were really happy about it. And some people were really, now we're being taped, so I'm not going to use the word they used, angry. Really angry. Now, why were people angry?
They were jealous.
Deacon. Jealous? I never thought of that. That's very interesting. They might have been jealous of that.
They couldn't do it.
They couldn't do that. Other people were angry because, what do you think?
They've done a terrible thing.
They've done a terrible thing. And what happens when we do a terrible thing? We should be punished. And actually the extension of that discussion goes like this, and it probably would apply to last week too. If they're not punished, other people will get the idea that there's permission to do that too. Now that's the logic in our head. That, however, is not the logic of a whole community of people. That's not their logic. That's not their life. That's not their way of being people. If I wanted to be as forgiving as an Amish person at this very moment, I'd have a hard time doing it. I wasn't raised in that household, as it were. Now, my household took the Bible very seriously. We read it every single night. I think I mentioned that to a couple of you before. I may have been the only person ever passed the Bible content exam the first time at my seminary. And I owe that to my mother. Bless her up there. You know, we read it every single night. And we talked about it. But we never took it like it was a rule book. We always took it like it was a companion. Okay? If there was 3 people in the room, it was you and me and Scripture. And it wasn't just the New Testament, I might add to that. Okay? The Bible was in the room with us all the time. So, we always had a companion on the journey. We always had a way to go forward. But what you can discover, and I talked about this in the sermon this morning, you can discover with different contexts and different, what do you guys say, emphases. You can come down in different places. You listen to the gospel this morning, it's really intriguing. If you sin, what should you do? Cut off your hand. If you sin, you should cut off your foot, if your foot causes you to sin. I've noticed that Jim Bakker is walking right through the world, all over again. Okay? Freely confessing that he sinned once upon a time. I'm talking about the TV preacher. In the inerrancy of the Bible, and taking the Bible as if it's a standard book of directions and rules, you'd be in a lot of trouble, wouldn't you? In no time at all. You'd be limping through life. I, for one, would be a paraplegic with my eyes open. That's where I would be. That's the kind of person I am. I know who I am. But the Amish have they tell stories that are so key to who they are. They're really, truly remarkable. One of the most important stories, cardinal story, was they're Anabaptists, which means that you must be baptized when you become an adult of assent. Okay? And so there's really 3 channels of religion in here. There's liturgical Catholic faith, there's Protestant faith, and there's Anabaptist faith. We don't tend to think about it that way, but the Anabaptists are really that different. And here's their cardinal story. I'm sorry I can't remember the man's name at the moment, but this is roughly the 16th century. And he's running to escape his assassins, his murderers, because he's an Anabaptist. And he runs across a Swiss lake. and he runs over cracking ice, and one of the soldiers behind him falls through the ice. Now, I grew up in Minnesota. What happens when you fall through the ice? I'd like to say you're toast, but it's really the opposite. You're an ice cube. You're going to die. This man turns around. This is cardinal story in their tradition. Turns around, goes back for the man, pulls him out of the ice, the soldier. Pulls him out of the ice. And in the process of doing so, is caught by the other soldiers that are traveling with him. And they put the man to death. Not a Hollywood outcome, is it? But a profoundly formative story if that's what you heard in Sunday school. If that was your life in Sunday school, was joy and a story about the sacrificial giving of life, you'd be a very different human being. One of the things we discovered in contemporary times, one of the gifts of modern philosophy was we discovered that we have convictions inside of us. And most of those convictions that are in there, we don't know they're there until they're tested. Do you know what I'm saying? Racism is one of the perfect ones. Let me just aim over racism for a moment. We don't know how we are as a racist until we have to interact with a racist situation, typically. And many of us, and I count myself among that, find ourselves surprised at how we respond. We think we're on top of it, we're intellectually there, we're Christians, we're clear about this, but it takes training to respond well. And if you don't have a lot of experience with that, then your convictions are going to cause you to do something, and then you're going to have to stop and think about those convictions. Convictions are so important that the theological rule for convictions is if your convictions were different, sizably different than they are right now, then you'd be a different person. That's how very different. That's how powerful convictions are. We tend to think our appearance, our education, our family, all those kinds of things are among the most important things in our lives, and indeed, perhaps they are. But that formation of convictions that are so deep-seated that they're unknown to us, that's powerful. And if you want to be a forgiving person, it really takes a community of people reinforcing that sense of forgiveness to be truly a forgiving person. Okay, let me stop there for a moment. Thoughts and remarks?
So this,
Yes.
this is more of a question than a remark or a thought, but so, and I'll just be transparent, this is my brother I'm speaking of, raised in the same family as me, in a Christian household, Anglican Episcopal household, and he has become very hardened against our government. And he's become very hardened against organized Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And to the point that he's just, like, the way he was acting and things he's saying, it makes me think that he's no longer a Christian, like he no longer has a relationship with Christ or God. And I said something to my sister-in-law, and it must have gotten back to him, and he sent me a note and said, I haven't left Christ, but he said, there is no evidence of Christ in Christianity in this country by the way the most visible Christians act. And he's so overwrought with this and so consumed with it, and it's clear that tendency towards forgiveness is just not there. And so how do you go about influencing people in your family and in your friends and your circles to try to embrace this when they've just lost it?
Well, I have a multivalent answer, but I'm going to start with the plainest answer I can do first. This starts with you. And you practicing forgiveness. And I just want to remind you that all forgiveness is costly. It's all expensive. Some more expensive than others, certainly. But all of it's expensive. One of the ways we talk about forgiveness, and I talk about it in the book, is called gift. When we give someone a gift without conditions, we don't expect anything back. I would urge you to think about your brother that way. That I'm giving you forgiveness and I don't expect anything in return. And I promise you, if that sinks in, that will throw a loop in him. Does he have a point of view that's shared by many people?
Yeah.
Truly. I think most of the people in the United States, if you say are Christian, Particularly in the last 20 years, what were they going to say? Right? They're going to have problems with it. I have a family, close family, or members of those rock rib sort of Baptist fundamentalist churches, and I love them. I don't care what they belong to in that respect, because I'm going to love them anyhow. But it's shocking to sit down and talk with somebody you've known all of your life and discover how narrow I perceive their Christianity to be. I think Christianity is a challenging exercise, but it can't be done by yourself, and that's his good point. If you think you can be a Christian all by yourself, you're seriously mistaken. If you think you can be a forgiving person all by yourself, you're seriously mistaken. Nobody can sustain this by themselves. I don't know if you noticed that there's a dedication at the beginning, and I don't mean to embarrass you, darling, but one of the things is that I was widowed some years ago, and it was a terrible and tragic death. It was horrible. I can't even tell you how bad it was. I really wandered around the world, and if you remember the sermon this morning, wandering being an issue for yourself, I wandered kind of lost and broken. And one of the wonderful things that my wife, Kathy, and her family and my family did for me was take me in. Without God and without them, I could not be healed. I cannot heal myself at times. And that's the same way with forgiveness. You cannot be a sustained forgiver without people around you going, I'm behind you. I'm 100% behind you. That guy's a jerk.
Exactly.
That guy is a complete jerk. We all agree about that. Now that we got that clear, forgive him. Because if you don't forgive, it's pretty clear. Nothing changes. Now, I talk in here about 3 strands of forgiveness. I talk about individual forgiveness, communal forgiveness, and I talk about divine forgiveness. So just, if I may, leading into that. Individual forgiveness is pretty much what we generally talk about. And that is the sense that I need to forgive you, you need to forgive me, and what we're trying to untie is the terrible burden, the chains of resentment. Nobody knows that better than AA. If you want to be one of the best religious movements of the 20th century, started by the Episcopalians, among others, one of the best movements of the 20th and 21st century is the recovery movement. And one of those things that they really work hard on is resentments, letting go of resentments. Now, one of the ways you let go of resentments, interestingly enough, is the 5th step. And I talk a little bit about it in here, in the paper I'll hand out here eventually. The 5th step is to tell your story and tell it truthfully.
That's right.
Okay? I worked for the Hazelden Foundation for a while. Let me pass these around since this sounds like a mystery. I worked for the Hazelden Foundation once upon a time, and I wrote a pamphlet for them that's still published after all these years later on the benefits of telling your story. And that came home to me, and I was in a training session at Hazelden in Center City, Minnesota. You picture that? Men and women are divided, so it's all men in the room. You following me? And in those days, everybody's drinking coffee out of styrofoam cups and smoking. You could still smoke in the building in those days. And so I'm sitting in a room, and they brought in AA members, came from the local community. I mean, AA has been going on in Minnesota for like day 2. Okay? And not by accident, as being Minnesotans. So they come in. I grew up in Minnesota, by the way, so I think I could speak with authority on that issue. But they come in from the outside. And then some of the people, this is near the end of your treatment cycle, if it's 30 days or 60 or 90 days. At near the end of your treatment cycle, 30 days, they come in, and you start hearing an AA meeting going. You kind of get it's not a fake dry run. It's a real AA meeting, but it goes on with you getting the opportunity to hear a real AA meeting at work. And I love this occurrence. I was sitting in this meeting, and this young guy who was near the end of his treatment, but plainly not getting it all, says he wants to talk to his old girlfriend, and it's part of the reason he's in there, because he was drinking with her, got in trouble, pushed her down a stairs accidentally, but he wanted to apologize to her. And he was professing that he was just going to restore that friendship. Nothing else was intended. And as you listen to the story, it didn't take too long before you realized a lot more was intended than that. And so the way the meeting went, we're sitting there listening. There was a bunch of, at that time I thought they were old guys. Now they're probably my age. Old guys sitting in there have been sober for many, many, many years, and they're in there. And one of them listens, and there's silence at the end of this guy's talk. Silence. And then more silence. You follow what I'm saying? Then the old guy is sort of at the head of the table, takes a big drag out of his cigarette, sticks it in his coffee cup, and goes. That's what he says to the young guy. You got to tell a story, tell it truthfully. And the way to do that really is fairly simple. Here's the story. The people telling it. Here's the audience or the listeners. One affects the other, like that. As simple as that. If you tell your story to an experienced group of people in recovery, they're going to hear your story. And they're going to be able to feed back to you what the issues are. One of the reasons you need to be a Christian with other people is just this. We have a story. And it starts in the Old Testament, and the trajectory goes forward to the book of Revelation in our particular tradition. We have a story. We have a story we can share with other people. We can bring a correction to an attitude. And it's very hard to do, but it's not impossible. People who profess Christianity, they have no sense of flexibility about the Christianity. And I would suggest they have not, in fact, read the gospel. They've heard the gospel preached to them in many cases, but they have not read the gospel in the sense that they have internalized it. Don't realize that there's a flexibility of interpretation there. Even Jesus says that. I didn't come to remove a jot or jittle from the law, but I came for the law to be established. And the law is a generosity of spirit. In a lot of Episcopal Sunday schools, it's called the 10 best ways of living. That's the, okay? The 10 best ways of living. Okay. So back to your brother. It can't be undone overnight. It may take forever to undo it. It may never get undone. But if you go into it with the idea that there's no time constraint on this, only God's time. And God's got all the time she wants. I'm serious. God's got all the time she wants. Because who made time? God. God's got all the time in the world. We just need to work with that time. We need to realize in the silence and the limits of our own life, the limitations of what we can do. We tend to think in our modern world, and I hear this, get involved in some athletic activities. Sky is the limit, do whatever you want, let your body grow, thrive, all that kind of stuff. Until suddenly you hit a big crack on the sidewalk, and what happens then? We get older. We discover our limitations. And in those limitations, we discover the meaning of time. Time is God's to deal with, as God sees fit. We just work with that time and those limitations and do the very best we can. And as you heard in the letter of James this morning, that's good enough. It's good enough. I think some Christians are really way too hard on other Christians because they don't think they're good enough. And all I can say to you is, as we know, if you want to know what a Christian looks like, you should be able to hold up the mirror, right? And see a Christian at work. Other things about forgiveness. Yes, ma'am.
Maybe I'm missing something, but I'm unclear, Suzanne, about what it is that you feel that you need to forgive your brother for.
I didn't ask the details about it.
Oh, no, it was more about the power of being in a Christian community. And he no longer recognizes the visible Christian community as being Christian. So he's like, I don't want to be part of that. And it's getting back to what Jeff said about you can't be a Christian in a silo. it's too hard.
Okay.
So how to pull him back into that? I don't need to forgive him of anything.
Okay.
I don't
Thank
think
you.
there's a philosopher of any significant order from the end of the 19th through the 20th and into the 21st century. People like Charles Taylor and Ludwig Wittgenstein, folks like that in mind, who believes we live in a Christian society. We don't even know how to be a Christian society. We don't have a picture of how to be a Christian society. If you just presume the person you're talking to is a Christian, try that in Bend.
Uh-oh.
That would be unfair to them and to you. So the way to be a Christian is what? You got to live like one. With, as I wrote it there, joy. And you got to train yourself to be that way. Because in our society, as I mentioned that in the sermon today, we certainly encourage, how should we say, individualism, right?
Yeah.
Being self-assertive, self-starting kind of people, if you will. That's how we encourage people to be. Be what you want to be. I've had friends that said to me, be whatever you want to be. I had somebody say that to me in seminary. Anybody can be what they want to be. And I said, so? You're an Amazonian Indian who's blind in one eye, and you have AIDS. Can you be a doctor? Because you want to be. And she was angry with me. She said, that doesn't count. Okay. But where do you draw the line? Where does the line begin? You follow what I'm saying? Okay.
What being in community then is when you are being whatever you want to be and somebody calls you on your stuff. Like the meeting that you were talking, which is what keeps us within community, is the fact that we can't just step on anybody's toes anytime we want to, just because we want to. That kind of thing to me is where forgiveness comes in. That whole idea is we're in community and we have to behave as if we're a part of community all the time, and there's the give and take. That whole idea of, if I step on Tom's toes every time I walk by him, he's going to pull his foot in, hopefully, to
I'm
not
gonna
let me
hit your
step on his toe. But he will still, there will be a forgiveness there of the fact that I do that.
Yes. And so the secular version of that is revenge, or tit for tat. You do it to me, I'm going to do it to you. And there's a guy named Axelrod, brilliant man. And have you ever heard of the tragedy of the commons? Probably one of the most important sociological discoveries of modern times. And you can look it up on, it was a guy at UCSB who wrote it, Tragedy of the Commons. Remember villages used to have a commons and everybody would graze their cows on there, right? Yeah. Okay? And you got to know that you could graze just so many cows on there, and what happened if you added another cow? Okay? So this guy's here, his daughter's getting married, and he needs more money. So he says, I'm going to get some more money. I'm going to put another cow on there. And what begins to happen? The resources that were in equilibrium are now out of equilibrium. And other people are looking at that and saying, wow, if he's got a cow on there, that's plainly the way to solve paying for a marriage of my son or my daughter. I'm going to put a cow on there. What happens to the cows? The herd dies at time, or is wiped out, or disease, or whatever the case may be. It's one of the tragedies of the commons. One of the ways around that, interestingly enough, if you're a computer, is a guy named David Axelrod wrote called Tit for Tat. You can run this on a computer. You can look it up. Run it on your computer. You have a computer at home. I know you do. And you can run Tit for Tat. And if you do Tit for Tat on a computer, what will happen is that the person who precipitates the first step in the tragedy of the commons will in turn time, because other people are responding in like kind, stop doing that, and hopefully the equilibrium will return. But people aren't like that, are they? People aren't computer programs. Now, having said that, I want to push past that because you're right about discipline. Christians are people of discipline. But it's not disciplining others. We need to discipline ourselves, number one. But the interesting thing about discipline also is it's a reward. If you get up every morning and you go for a half hour, 45, an hour long walk, what's going to happen to you over time? You're going to be stronger, healthier, fitter. Your immune system is going to work. That's a discipline too. We feel better. Here's the weird part about us, and we're human beings. We feel better when we're doing what God created us for than when we're doing what God didn't create us for. We're miserable. I lived in California, Los Angeles area. Parked out in front of my church. Every given Sunday were 2 Rolls Royces and a Bentley. Very frequently, trains of Ferraris would go by our house. Okay. Were those people happier than you? I don't think so. Because I don't know about you, every time I park my car, I got to park it at the, when it's brand new, I got to park it at the end of the parking lot so it doesn't get door dinged, right?
Yeah.
Just think what if you have a Rolls Royce. Okay, you're just living with a burden all the time. That's a miniature, infinitesimal example. If we live as God called us to live, we can find joy in that discipline. We are fulfilled in that discipline. We're artists. Because the wonderful thing about being what God has created you to be is there's incredible, huge amount of freedom to be what you want to be. Here's the canvas, here's the paints, go at it. And we can do that. I know Judd spends a lot of time on that around here because we have groups and classes and sessions and meetings and all this kind of stuff. And they're not just so we can have meetings, groups, classes, and sessions. They're about disciplining ourselves to be a community when the rest of the world isn't interested. And your brother needs to see this community work. And if he saw this community work and you say, well, what's his name, Bob?
Brady.
Brady?
No joke.
Brady? Here it is. You want to see it at work? Here it is. I just want to show it to you. So that I talk about that at length in the book is about real stories, real people. The most moving one in there for me is the brothers in Algeria, and they're in the Atlas Mountains. And I'm not sure the exact year, I'm sorry to say. There's a movie out there, and you can see the movie. You don't have to read the book in this case. It's a very fine movie. These guys are up in the Atlas Mountains. They're monks. And they're told by the local Muslim warlords that they're going to be killed. And they need it. The police, the soldiers, everybody says, you got to get out of here. You got to get out. And so they get together, they pray, they weep, there's sorrow, they argue with one another, but they meet as a group and they sort it out and they work it through and they say, if we run, Christ has no power. And they stay. And they die. But as my son, who works in the recovery field, says, nobody dies in vain. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about that story, ever since I first saw it or heard about it. I don't know why. It just, one of these things just stuck with me. They worked it out. They met as a group. They talked to one another. They wrestled with the issues. How are we going to handle this? What are we going to do? And they've been up there in the Atlas Mountains teaching farming and agriculture, the French monks. Teaching that to the people around there so they can better survive in this difficult world. And Islam, radical Islam, it's radical Islam, not Islam, which is from salam, from peace, okay? Radical Islam is a different kind of thing. We have that kind of stuff in the United States too, right? Radical Islam is to defeat people, to destroy, to seize their freedom. And they want to seize their freedom by putting them to death. And real story really happens. They stay. They face the consequences. They die. And now that you've heard this story, will you forget it? Those are real stories, real people. And their disposition is to be forgiving people. They're a community of forgiveness. And if you read the book, you'll discover that the senior monk had written in a letter like a couple days beforehand. He said, I'm facing my death and I want you to know that I forgive the people that killed me. And then he explains why. So for $10. He said, one more question and then I need to suit up for the next liturgy. Yes.
You opened with what was with the hearings this last week.
Yes.
Could you bring it back to that?
I can. I mean, I've been all modern current events observations are always problematical, to say the least, because as time goes by, circumstances and context begins to shift into place, and we can see things in a way we couldn't see before. I will say, to me, from my point of view, is I'm shocked at the number of people on either, if this is a matter of sides, and I suspect it is for the moment. I'm shocked, and these people I know on both sides have already made up their mind, and this is the way it is. And I thought, one of the key moments, and I know Jeff Flake. I've never voted for him, but I might now. Okay? When he said, I'm not going to sign this until there's an investigation, that's what you do. You find out the facts. You get in there, you get involved. That's step 2 of forgiveness. That's communal forgiveness. And in communal forgiveness, you find out what's going on. And your purpose in that is what? Start a fight? What? Forgive. Reconciliation and forgiveness. Reconciliation being one of the aspects of forgiveness, and communal forgiveness, which is strand 2 forgiveness. I don't know the answer to it, and I dread one of the problems with contemporary news is like that comes up on Twitter or whatever, and you don't have time to think, digest it, reflect on it, or get the gospel truth, which you find on the front page of the New York Times. Seriously. I don't know what's going to happen. But I know that God gave us a gift of forgiveness. And forgiveness means it's a gift of life, an affirmation. And that all the powers in this world cannot prevail against us. And that, the resurrection defeated death. Death is what most people hold over our heads. Whether it be death physically or death spiritually. I think one of the things that Dr. Ford said was she was afraid she was going to die. That's a terrifying thing if you've ever been in that place. Okay? There's a gift to forgive in there somewhere. I don't know how this is going to work out, but I certainly pray for them all the time. I would certainly encourage you to do the same. I don't know how prayer works. I really don't. I don't have any one-for-one formula for it, but I do believe it works. And my wife and I have experience of that in our own life. Thank you for your time. I'm really grateful for your time. And if you take something away from this morning, try to remember joy. Joy. J-O-Y. And, if you can get, I know you can buy those and put them up in the window or whatever the case may be. Joy. We have signs at our house. We have one right next to the sink, kitchen sink, and it says, wash your hands and say your prayers. Because Jesus and germs are everywhere. See you later.